Picture this. One ordinary morning, your phone alarm goes off. You check the weather, scroll social media, maybe order a coffee. All of that feels normal, but hidden behind those casual gestures is an invisible web of satellites that woke up long before you did. Now imagine that in the first 10 minutes of a crisis, half of those satellites are jammed, dazzled, or outright destroyed. Maps freeze, stock markets flicker, missile warning radars lose parts of the sky, aircraft stumble across oceans nearly blind, and nobody has fired a shot on Earth yet. The first battle has already been fought above your head. That is the world we are sliding into, a world where the rise of space forces turns orbit into the new high ground of war. The key question I want you to keep in mind is this. If war comes to space, does it look like Star Wars dogfights, or like someone quietly unplugging the nervous system of modern civilization? Because most military planners will tell you, the second version is far more realistic. Space war is less about lasers cutting starships in half and more about silencing the satellites that make 21st century warfare possible. In other words, whoever can fight and win in, from, and to space gains a decisive advantage over any opponent that still treats orbit as a peaceful backdrop. The United States, China, Russia, and a growing list of others clearly understand this. Whether the public does is a different story. To understand how we got to a world with dedicated space forces, we need to rewind to the Cold War. From the very beginning, space and war have been joined at the hip. The same rockets that launched Sputnik and Explorer 1 began life as intercontinental ballistic missiles. Early reconnaissance satellites gave the superpowers something new: the ability to look over the other side's shoulder every day and verify what their bombers and missile silos actually looked like. That surveillance did not just feed targeting lists, it reduced paranoia and helped keep nuclear war theoretical instead of real. When people call the 1991 Gulf War the first space war, they are pointing to GPS-guided bombs, satellite communications, and weather data that let coalition forces see and strike Iraqi forces in a way that would have been impossible a generation earlier. Space was already part of the battlefield, we just chose not to look up. At the same time, diplomats tried to put some limits on this new domain. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty banned nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit and prohibited military bases or maneuvers on celestial bodies. It declared that space should be used for peaceful purposes and be the province of all humankind. That sounds reassuring until you notice what the treaty does not forbid. It does not ban conventional weapons in space. It does not ban military satellites. It does not ban jamming, hacking, or blinding an opponent's assets. In fact, it explicitly allows military personnel to support peaceful uses of space. In other words, it drew a bright red line around nuclear weapons in orbit, but left a lot of gray area for everything else. Today's space forces operate in that gray area, constantly pushing to gain advantage without crossing the threshold that would trigger universal condemnation. So why declare space a separate war-fighting domain now? Why create a space force instead of just letting air forces and strategic rocket troops handle these missions as they have for decades? The short answer is density and dependence. In the 1960s, there were a handful of military satellites. Today, there are thousands of active satellites in orbit, and military operations depend on them at every level: positioning, navigation and timing, communications, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, missile warning, even basic logistics planning. If you removed space support from a modern joint force, its effectiveness would collapse faster than most people care to admit. That dependency turns orbit into a prime target. Once war planners realize that, they start asking a hard question: who is actually responsible for defending this domain? Space forces are the political answer to that operational problem. There is also a psychological dimension. A separate service signals to allies and adversaries that a state is serious about space as a theater of conflict. When the United States formally established the Space Force as a separate branch under the Department of the Air Force in December 2019, it was not just bureaucratic reshuffling. It was a message. Space is no longer just an enabler. It is a contested domain that needs its own doctrine, its own culture, and its own officers who wake up in the morning thinking about orbital order of battle. China and Russia have reached similar conclusions, although they organize their forces differently. Once multiple great powers start building specialized institutions for the same domain, history suggests that domain is going to matter in the next crisis. Now let us walk through who is actually preparing to fight that war above Earth. Because the term Space Force can be misleading. Not every country calls its organization by that name, but several already operate in a way that matches it. We will start with the United States, then examine China, then Russia, and finally, the secondary layer of middle powers and commercial actors that complicate the picture even further. The United States Space Force is the most formalized of the new space militaries. It sits under the Department of the Air Force, much like the Marine Corps sits under the Department of the Navy, and has a relatively lean personnel roster on the order of the low tens of thousands. That small size often surprises people because they associate force with divisions and fleets. In reality, space power is capital-intensive rather than manpower-intensive. What matters is the network of satellites, ground stations, and command centers the Guardians, as its members are called, operate. The Space Force's core tasks can be grouped into three big buckets: achieving space superiority by protecting friendly assets and, if necessary, threatening hostile ones; providing global mission operations from space, such as GPS and secure communications; and assuring space access through launch and range operations. Its frontline units are not squadrons of fighters. They are mission deltas that run constellations, track objects in orbit, conduct space domain awareness, and coordinate with allied operators. Operationally, American space power leans on several pillars: proliferated satellite constellations in low Earth orbit for communications and imaging, highly capable but fewer satellites in geostationary orbit for missile warning and global communications, a robust launch industrial base anchored by companies like SpaceX and United Launch Alliance, and a long-running family of experimental platforms such as the X-37B spaceplane, which has demonstrated the ability to conduct very long-duration missions, change orbits, and return payloads. One way to think about this is that the United States is trying to make its space architecture both resilient and agile. Resilient by having many nodes, so no single loss is catastrophic. Agile by having maneuverable platforms and rapid launch to plug gaps and complicate enemy targeting. The Space Force's challenge is to integrate these pieces into a coherent warfighting doctrine instead of just a collection of impressive engineering projects. China has taken a different organizational route, but is aiming at a similar goal. For years, most of its military space activities were concentrated in the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force. This organization fused space, cyber, and electronic warfare under one umbrella, reflecting Beijing's view that information dominance is the key to modern war. In 2024, China reorganized again, dissolving the Strategic Support Force and creating new dedicated arms, including a PLA Aerospace Force to handle the space mission. You can read that rebranding in two ways. On one hand, it simplifies command chains and signals a more mature division of labor. On the other, it underlines just how central space has become to China's military planning. Chinese doctrine openly talks about destroying, damaging, and interfering with the enemy's reconnaissance and communications satellites at critical moments in a conflict. The tools for that include direct ascent missiles, co-orbital satellites that can maneuver close to other spacecraft, and a rapidly growing fleet of dual-use platforms that can be described as experimental in peacetime and offensive in wartime. One telling example is the reported testing of satellites capable of close-in maneuvers that resemble dogfighting in orbit. According to U.S. Space Force officials, Chinese Xi'an and Shijian series satellites have been observed performing complex choreographies around each other, practicing proximity operations that could be used for inspection, grappling, or disabling an adversary's spacecraft. On paper, these platforms are often labeled as space environment monitors or technology demonstrators. In practice, any satellite that can sidle up to another and interact with it physically or electronically is a potential weapon. The important contrast with the U.S. is cultural. American space planners talk a lot about resilience and protection. Chinese writings spend more time on offense and denying the opponent the ability to use space as freely as they do. Russia presents a third pattern. It is no longer in the same economic league as the United States or China, but it inherited a deep Soviet legacy in both launch and space warfare concepts. Instead of a clean Space Force label, Russia embeds most of its military space functions in its aerospace forces and associated space troops. That structure may look messy on paper, but it supports a practical mix of legacy early warning satellites, electronic warfare units, and a suite of counterspace capabilities. The most notorious of these is the Noudal Direct Ascent anti-satellite system. In 2021, Russia used a Noudal missile to destroy one of its own defunct satellites, Cosmos 1408, creating around 1,500 trackable pieces of debris and forcing the crew of the International Space Station to shelter as fragments passed nearby. It was a very loud way of saying, "We can reach into low Earth orbit with kinetic force if we want to." Russia also experiments with less visible tools, including directed energy systems like the Peresvet laser, which officials have hinted could be used against satellites' optical sensors, and satellites suspected of testing co-orbital tactics. If you compare Russian and Chinese approaches, Russia appears more comfortable with debris-creating tests and spectacular demonstrations, while China has gradually shifted to non-destructive tests after its infamous 2007 ASAT strike generated thousands of pieces of long-lived debris that still haunt low Earth orbit today. Both, however, are investing in the same menu of capabilities. The real divergence lies in budgets and industrial depth. Moscow can be dangerous but cannot continuously outspend or out-innovate Washington and Beijing in the space arena. That reality pushes Russia toward asymmetric, high-impact tools designed to offset its disadvantages on the ground. Beyond the big three, several middle powers are building narrower space warfare toolkits. India demonstrated a direct ascent ASAT capability in 2019 with Mission Shakti, intercepting one of its own satellites at relatively low altitude to limit debris persistence. European states operate advanced military and dual-use satellites and contribute heavily to space situational awareness, but remain politically cautious about overt space weapons. Meanwhile, commercial mega-constellations such as Starlink add a new layer of complexity. They are not military in name, but Ukraine's use of commercial satellite communications in its defense has shown how quickly private infrastructure can become a strategic target. In a future conflict, an adversary might find itself asking an uncomfortable question. Can we attack that network if it is owned by a foreign corporation and used by many countries, but is clearly supporting our enemy's war effort? Space law has not fully caught up to this reality. If the players are clear, the next question is, what are they actually preparing to do to each other in orbit? This is where we need to stop thinking in terms of starfighters and start thinking like artillerymen and hackers. Space warfare today revolves around three big themes: control of orbital terrain, methods of attack on satellites, and the race to make constellations more resilient than the weapons designed to kill them. First, orbits really are terrain, not in the sense of hills and rivers, but in terms of geometry, timing, and energy. Low Earth orbit is like a crowded coastal highway. It is home to imaging satellites, mega constellations that provide broadband and many scientific platforms. Objects there circle the planet roughly every 90 minutes. They are easy to reach with missiles, but also relatively quick to replace. Geostationary orbit, by contrast, is the high plateau over the equator. A satellite there appears to hover over one spot on Earth, which makes it ideal for communications and missile warning. It is harder to get to and harder to maneuver in. Lose a key asset there and you cannot just toss up a replacement overnight. Then you have the medium Earth and highly elliptical orbits in between and beyond, each with its own tactical uses. A realistic space campaign looks less like a free-for-all and more like maneuvering forces on different layers of a three-dimensional chessboard, constrained by orbital mechanics. Second, the ways to attack in space are broader than many people assume. The most dramatic category is direct ascent anti-satellite weapons. These are missiles launched from the ground or the sea that fly up and hit a satellite at high relative velocity, turning it into a cloud of debris. The United States tested such a system in the 1980s, China in 2007, India in 2019, Russia in 2021. These systems are loud, visible, and diplomatically costly when used destructively because the debris can threaten everyone's satellites, including your own. That is why there is now a push at the United Nations to establish a norm against debris-creating tests, with multiple states endorsing a moratorium on such activities. The fact that diplomats are scrambling to ban the tests, not the weapons themselves, tells you how far along this technology already is. More subtle are co-orbital weapons. Instead of launching a missile straight up at a target, you place a satellite in orbit that can maneuver close to another object, then interfere with it. The interference might be physical, like a grappling arm nudging it off course or damaging a solar panel. It might be electronic, like a payload that emits jamming signals right next to the victim's antennas. Or it might be a cyber tool that uses proximity to access internal networks. Analysts have started calling these space stalkers because they can quietly shadow a target for days or weeks before doing anything overt. Here is a question worth pondering. Which is more destabilizing? A big, noisy missile test that everyone can see and condemn, or a small inspector satellite that may or may not have a hidden attack mode? Most space strategists fear the second. Ambiguity breeds miscalculation. Then there is non-kinetic warfare. You do not have to physically touch a satellite to ruin its day. Uplink jamming can disrupt its control signals. Downlink jamming can deny users the data it sends. Spoofing can feed false GPS signals to ships, aircraft, or missiles, causing them to miscalculate their positions. High-power lasers can dazzle or damage optical sensors. Cyber operations can hijack ground control stations or the data processing pipelines that turn raw satellite feeds into usable intelligence. None of this leaves shrapnel floating around the planet. All of it can be denied, disguised, or blamed on interference. For military planners, non-kinetic tools are attractive because they sit in a gray zone. They can massively degrade an opponent's space support without crossing the political red lines associated with blowing hardware into fragments. There is also the controversial concept of using space to attack targets on Earth directly. Ideas like rods from God or kinetic bombardment platforms that drop dense projectiles from orbit, converting orbital energy into devastating impacts. The Outer Space Treaty bans nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in orbit, but it does not explicitly outlaw conventional orbital bombardment. In practice, though, the engineering challenges and escalatory risks make such systems unlikely in the near term. They are useful as thought experiments because they force us to ask how existing law would handle a non-nuclear but strategically devastating space-based weapon. For now, the more immediate threat is not orbital artillery, but the loss of the support functions that make precision artillery and missiles on Earth so deadly. On the other side of the ledger is resilience. How do you keep fighting when your space layer is under attack? The first answer is numbers. Instead of relying on a small handful of exquisite satellites, Militaries are moving toward proliferated constellations with dozens or hundreds of nodes. Knocking out one does not cripple the system. It just forces a slight rerouting of data. The second answer is diversity. Mix orbits, mix vendors, mix communication paths. Use both dedicated military satellites and commercial services, fiber optic cables, and high-altitude drones, so no single attack mode can blind you. The third answer is maneuver and rapid reconstitution. Spaceplanes and responsive launch capabilities make it possible, in theory, to plug gaps quickly, or to move critical payloads around like chess pieces instead of static targets. It all sounds elegant. The uncomfortable reality is that resilience is expensive. Offense, especially jamming and cyber tools, is comparatively cheap. That imbalance is driving a constant race between those who build the orbital web and those who look for the cheapest thread to cut. So far, we have stayed at the technical and doctrinal level. But what would the first real war above Earth actually look like? Let us sketch a plausible scenario, not science fiction, just a logical extension of capabilities that already exist or are under active development. Imagine a regional crisis in the late 2020s or early 2030s, maybe in the Western Pacific over Taiwan, or in Eastern Europe over a NATO member. Tensions have been climbing for months. Cyber skirmishes, naval close calls, air intercepts. On day zero of open hostilities, the political leadership of one major power realizes a brutal fact. If it allows the opponent to enjoy full space support, its ships, aircraft, and ground forces will be continuously tracked, targeted, and jammed. So instead of waiting to be slowly strangled, it orders a preemptive space campaign, calibrated to do three things: blind the opponent's regional picture, disrupt its communications during the decisive opening days, and demonstrate enough capability to scare third parties away from providing space support. The first moves are almost entirely non-kinetic. High-power uplink jammers flood specific satellite control channels in theater. Downlink jammers blossom near key bases and ports, cutting off GPS and satellite communications over targeted zones. Dazzling lasers briefly blind imaging satellites about to pass over critical staging areas. On the cyber front, malware that has been quietly embedded in ground station networks for months is activated, forcing operators to shut down certain control systems and fall back on manual procedures. Notice what has not happened yet. No debris, no explosions in orbit, just silence in the wrong places at the wrong time. To the public, the opening of this war might look like a strange cluster of airline delays, GPS anomalies, and temporary outages of satellite television. At the same time, a layer deeper, co-orbital assets begin to move. A so-called inspector satellite that has spent months loitering near a military communications satellite nudges closer and deploys a small payload. That payload might emit localized jamming right on top of the target, making it unusable. Or it might use a mechanical arm to rotate the satellite slightly, disrupting its pointing accuracy. The point is not destruction, but denial. A damaged but intact satellite is just as useless for the duration of a battle. Meanwhile, a handful of dual-use satellites belonging to commercial operators start to experience anomalies. A thruster fires at the wrong time. A software glitch forces a reboot. Individually, each incident is ambiguous. Collectively, they form a pattern. Someone is reaching into orbit with a scalpel. At what point does this cross the threshold into open space warfare that the world cannot ignore? Probably when the first kinetic strike happens. Perhaps a carefully chosen direct ascent intercept against a defunct or soon-to-be deorbited satellite, timed to send a deterrent message without flooding orbit with long-lived debris. Or a strike against a small experimental military satellite in a low-altitude orbit where most debris will quickly decay. The attacking state frames it as a test. The defending state calls it an act of aggression. Insurance markets panic. Commercial satellite operators hold emergency conferences. Airlines and shipping companies quietly reroute traffic relying on alternative positioning and communication sources. You can see how quickly a limited space engagement, meant to gain tactical edge, cascades into global economic consequences. Inside military headquarters, the pressure is intense. Commanders who grew up with satellite-enabled situational awareness find themselves fighting with partial maps and slower data. Logistics officers trying to route convoys and convoys of resupply suddenly have to fall back on older navigation methods. Submarine forces that rely on very precise timing for communications and missile launches worry about the integrity of their clocks. A blunt but honest question arises. Should we retaliate in space, potentially escalating the conflict into a full orbital slugfest? Or absorb the blows and husband our limited counterspace tools for only the most critical targets? In other words, is space now just another front, or has it become the front? If you are wondering where the Space Force sits in all of this, the answer is right at the center of the decision loop. Space commanders will be the ones recommending which satellites to sacrifice, which to maneuver, which frequencies to shift, which ground stations to harden, and ultimately, which enemy space assets to put at risk in response. They will be juggling physics, politics, and escalation theory in real time. Fire on that jammed but still physically intact satellite, and you set a precedent. Let that co-orbital stalker come closer to your missile warning platform, and you risk your nuclear deterrent's eyes. There is a reason space strategists spend so much time talking about escalation ladders in this domain. Space is deeply integrated with nuclear command and control. Any attack that touches that layer, even indirectly, will make national leaders extremely nervous. One thing that often gets overlooked in futuristic discussions is logistics. We tend to picture space war as pure high-tech maneuver. In reality, it sits on top of very earthly supply chains. Rockets need propellant. Ground stations need power, data links, and physical security. Highly trained space operators need years of education and specialized simulators. Launch ranges have finite capacity and vulnerability to sabotage or missile attack. Imagine trying to reconstitute a constellation under fire. You need launch windows, available boosters, integration facilities, and the ability to get payloads to the pad without their shipping containers being targeted. The U.S. attempt to diversify launch providers and create more responsive launch capability is partly about cost and innovation, but it is also about logistics in wartime. If only one or two pads can loft your critical satellites, those pads become prime targets. Commercial partnerships complicate logistics in both helpful and risky ways. On the positive side, contracting companies like SpaceX or others to orbit national security payloads spreads the burden, leverages private investment, and can dramatically increase launch cadence. We have already seen the U.S. Space Force award large, multi-year launch contracts to multiple vendors as part of its national security space launch program. On the negative side, if your war plan depends heavily on commercial mega-constellations or privately owned launchers, you need legal and contractual frameworks that spell out what happens under attack. Do you have priority access? Who bears the risk if a launch under wartime conditions fails, whether by accident or sabotage? How do you compensate a company if its civilian customers abandon it because they fear being associated with a military target? These are not glamorous questions, but they will shape how robust space power really is when the shooting starts. Intelligence is another layer where space war and war on Earth blur. Satellites provide exquisite overhead imagery, signals intelligence, and missile warning. But they also represent intelligence targets themselves. Adversaries will want to know which satellite is carrying what payload, which frequency it uses, how often it maneuvers, and what command protocols its operators follow. That knowledge makes interference or deception easier. In peacetime, this takes the form of close approach inspections, cyber probing, and open-source analysis. In wartime, it will translate into very targeted attacks on the crown jewels of an opponent's orbital architecture. If you were planning a surprise long-range strike, the first thing you would ask your space and cyber teams is, how many of their eyes and ears can we close without triggering panic? In that sense, the rise of space forces is not just about defending objects in orbit. It is about defending the information flows that those objects enable. All of this leads to a sobering realization. A war above Earth might not look dramatic to the average person at all. There will be no flashes in the sky visible to the naked eye, no dogfights that you can stream live. Instead, you will feel it through cascading disruptions, navigation systems glitching, financial markets taking longer to clear trades, weather forecasts becoming less accurate, militaries complaining about degraded satellite support. The real action will take place in secure operations centers, where rows of operators stare at orbital tracks and signal traces, quietly shifting assets around to keep the system functioning. That is less cinematic than starfighters. It is also much more frightening, because it means the line between wartime and peacetime could blur into a persistent, low-level contest in orbit that never fully turns off. Given that trajectory, what lessons should we draw, and what can be done to keep the rise of space forces from turning the heavens into a permanent battlefield? Here, we need to zoom back out and think strategically rather than tactically. First, space is already militarized. The debate now is about weaponization and norms. Every major military relies on satellites and operates them with explicit war-fighting missions in mind. The Outer Space Treaty will not magically reverse that. But there is room to build new norms that at least constrain the most destabilizing behaviors, such as debris creating tests or attacks on nuclear command and control satellites. The emerging norm against destructive direct ascent ASAT testing, reflected in national pledges and United Nations resolutions, is an example. It does not ban the weapons, but it stigmatizes reckless demonstrations. Is that enough? Probably not. But imagine the orbital environment today if debris-producing tests had continued at the pace of the early 2000s. Sometimes, not enough is still far better than nothing. Second, we should recognize that space deterrence is messy. On Earth, you can park a battalion on a border and everyone can see it. In orbit, many capabilities are dual use and hard to distinguish. A satellite that can rendezvous and dock for repair can also rendezvous and interfere. A powerful ground laser used for tracking and research can also dazzle. That ambiguity makes it hard to signal intentions. One possible route around this is greater transparency and data sharing about close approaches and unusual maneuvers, combined with agreed rules of the road for safe distances and notification. But transparency cuts both ways. Show too much and you help adversaries refine their targeting. Show too little and you increase the risk that a routine test will be misinterpreted as an attack. Space forces will spend a lot of their time navigating this tension. Third, resilience should be seen not just as a technical concept, but as a strategic one. If you design your architecture so that it can absorb some level of attack and still function, you reduce the incentive for an adversary to go all in on a massive opening salvo. If they know that destroying 10 satellites will not blind you, they may choose more limited gray zone actions instead. In that sense, spending money on proliferated constellations and redundant links is not just insurance against physical loss. It is a way to shape the kinds of attacks adversaries consider worthwhile. Of course, there is a risk that high resilience might make leaders less cautious about entering conflicts because they feel protected. That psychological effect should be part of strategic planning. Technology never operates in a vacuum, not even in space. Fourth, the integration of commercial actors into national space defense needs a clearer conceptual framework. You and I might be impressed that private companies can deploy thousands of satellites or offer rapid launch. Military planners see something else, too. A big, attractive target surface that does not fall neatly under existing rules of engagement. Should a hostile state be allowed to jam or hack a commercial constellation that is providing critical communications to its enemy's military? If so, under what conditions? If not, how do you enforce that prohibition? Space forces will increasingly find themselves acting not just as operators, but as intermediaries between governments and corporations. That role will create new political and legal pressures that traditional armed services did not face to the same degree. Finally, we need to ask ourselves a blunt question. Do we really want a dedicated war above Earth? Or are we better served by treating space as a domain where competition is fierce, but certain red lines are observed? Complete demilitarization is unrealistic. The genie left the bottle decades ago, but partial restraint is not. We have managed, with all our flaws, to avoid nuclear war for more than 70 years through a mix of treaties, norms, and sheer fear. A similar cocktail could prevent the worst space warfare scenarios. Things like explicit protections for satellites involved in nuclear command and control, agreements not to target certain classes of weather or humanitarian imagery satellites, shared rapid notification channels for suspected debris creating events. None of these ideas will eliminate risk. They might, however, keep a bad day from turning into humanity's worst day. As space forces rise and war planning extends above Earth, the essential truth remains the same. Space is not really a separate arena divorced from life down here. It is a mirror and a multiplier. Whatever we project into orbit in terms of technology and intent will come back to us in the form of stability or chaos on the ground. So the next time you casually check a map on your phone or watch live footage from halfway around the world, remember this: you are already a user of space power. The question is whether the people building the new Guardians, aerospace forces, and space troops can keep that power available in crisis without letting conflict in orbit spin out of control. If you want to understand where space forces are really heading, it helps to stop staring at rockets for a moment and start thinking in terms of older revolutions in warfare on Earth. When steam-powered navies appeared in the 19th century, most politicians still thought in terms of armies and fortresses. When air forces were born after the First World War, many generals saw aircraft as flying artillery for the ground troops, rather than a separate instrument of power. Space today sits in that uncomfortable in-between phase. Too important to ignore, not yet fully understood by the people who will decide when to use it in anger. There is a pattern here. New domains do not become central overnight. First, they appear as auxiliaries. Naval guns support sieges. Aircraft spot for artillery. Satellites provide weather and navigation. Then a few sharp minds start asking an annoying question. If this support function is so critical, can it be attacked directly? Once the answer becomes yes, doctrine and institutions scramble to catch up. That is how you go from balloons tied to trenches to independent air forces. And it is how you go from a few orbital weather platforms to a space force with its own uniforms and its own budget. Think about the idea of a fleet in being. In classic naval strategy, a weaker fleet could still exert influence just by existing. If it stayed in port but remained capable, the stronger navy had to respect it, guard against a sortie, and devote forces to watching it. Now translate that into orbit. A constellation in being is a network of satellites and ground systems that may never fire a shot, yet constantly shape what an opponent dares to do on Earth. As long as it can see, communicate, and navigate, it silently pushes enemy commanders into more cautious choices. Destroying it outright might be escalatory madness, but leaving it untouched hands your opponent a permanent advantage. You can see why strategists are so obsessed with space resilience and counterspace tools. They are trying to avoid an orbital version of helplessly watching an enemy fleet sail up and down your coastline. The analogy goes even further. Air power advocates in the interwar years promised that bomber fleets could break an enemy's will directly. Reality turned out more complex. Strategic bombing mattered, but it worked best as part of a combined system with ground and naval forces. Space power is following a similar curve. Early enthusiasts claimed that whoever controlled space would control Earth. In practice, space control looks less like ruling from orbit and more like ensuring that your terrestrial forces are never deaf, dumb, or blind. The Space Force is not a magic wand. It is a nervous system. If it works, the rest of the military fights like a coordinated organism. If it fails, that organism starts to stumble. This historical perspective also tells you something about timing. Naval theory needed decades to mature after ironclads. Air doctrine evolved painfully through the Second World War. Space doctrine is barely out of its infancy. You can already see debates among officers about whether space forces should mainly defend and enable, or whether they should aim for aggressive offensive operations in orbit. Should a space force behave more like a coast guard that protects vital infrastructure, or more like a strategic bomber command that seeks to shock and paralyze the enemy? The honest answer is that it will need to be both at different times, and that dual identity will create real tension inside the institution. If we zoom in from grand theory to daily life inside a space service, another layer becomes visible. Space warfare starts with people who sit in dark rooms looking at screens full of dots and lines. The glamorous image is pilot-turned-astronaut. The reality is operator-turned-orbital traffic controller, part engineer and part air defense officer. These people train not to pull triggers, but to maintain orbits, manage frequencies, and interpret telemetry that tells them whether a satellite is healthy or under attack. From a distance, that can sound dull. Up close, it is nerve-wracking, because a single wrong decision in a tight window can send $1 billion asset tumbling into a useless orbit. Space forces are building a new professional culture around this work. They need operators who understand orbital mechanics deeply enough to improvise. They need intelligence officers who can fuse radar tracks, optical observations, radio frequency data, and cyber signatures into a coherent picture of who is doing what in orbit. They need engineers who can talk to both groups and translate operational needs into technical specs for the next generation of satellites. And above them, they need commanders who can explain all of this in plain language to political leaders who may never have studied physics beyond high school. If you think that is easy, try explaining differential drag to someone who is used to thinking in terms of tank brigades per kilometer of front line. Training reflects this complexity. Space forces run war games in which the enemy does not advance across a map, but begins spoofing GPS signals over a theater. In those simulations, the questions are subtle. At what point do you declare that an anomaly is not a glitch, but an attack? Who has the authority to maneuver a satellite, spending precious fuel, and perhaps revealing that it has more agility than the enemy assumed? When do you inform allies and commercial partners that you suspect a hostile act in orbit? And how do you do so without either inciting panic or appearing weak? These are decisions that traditional militaries rarely had to make at scale before. They turned space officers into part tactician, part diplomat, and part crisis manager. Inter-service politics adds another twist. Anytime a new branch appears, the older services worry about losing missions and budgets. Air forces are particularly sensitive here because they have long considered space an extension of their domain. From their perspective, satellites were just very high-flying aircraft whose primary job was to support air and joint operations. Space advocates respond that orbital warfare is different enough to warrant its own doctrine and promotion paths. If you bury space units inside an air force, you risk subordinating their needs to pilots and bombers. You also risk losing talent, because officers who specialize in space may see their career ceilings capped compared to those who rotate through more traditional combat roles. These debates are not just bureaucratic turf wars. They shape who ends up in key decision chairs when a crisis hits. Let us connect all this back to real conflicts that have already tested pieces of space warfare, even if nobody declared a war in space outright. The United States and its allies have been quietly using space power in every major operation since the end of the Cold War. But the most vivid recent example is the war in Ukraine. There, the role of commercial satellites has been especially striking. Imagery from private constellations has allowed journalists and analysts to track troop movements, damage to infrastructure, and even grave sites. For military planners, those same images provide near real-time situational awareness that used to be the jealously guarded province of a few spy agencies. Ukraine's forces have also relied on commercial satellite communications to keep units connected even when terrestrial networks are destroyed or jammed. From a space warfare perspective, Ukraine is a laboratory. We have seen reports of jamming attempts against satellite communication terminals. We have seen cyber attacks aimed at modems used for satellite links. We have seen a contest not only for territory on the ground, but for electromagnetic access in the sky above it. Yet notice what has not happened. No widely acknowledged deliberate destruction of each other's satellites in orbit. No kinetic ASAT exchanges that fill low Earth orbit with debris clouds. That restraint is not because either side lacks the technical means. It is because both understand that escalating to overt space attacks could invite reciprocal blows that would hurt them as much as their enemy. This reveals a paradox. Space forces are being built precisely because states expect future wars to involve space. At the same time, those same states fear that a truly unconstrained fight in orbit would be a long-term disaster. So everyone walks a tightrope. They push hard in jamming, cyber operations, and close approach maneuvers. They test anti-satellite missiles on their own assets to send signals. But they stop just short of open orbital brawls during ongoing wars. How long that tightrope can hold is an open question. It depends on how confident leaders feel that they can get what they want on Earth without smashing the orbital systems that both sides rely on. Middle powers and alliances complicate this picture. Nations that cannot afford full-fledged space forces still depend on space, and many now contribute niche capabilities to a larger network. Some focus on ground-based sensors that track objects in orbit. Some specialize in particular types of satellites, such as radar imaging that can see through clouds and darkness. Others invest in command centers that integrate data from multiple partners. In an alliance like NATO, the result is a patchwork quilt of national assets stitched together by shared protocols and data links. On paper, that looks messy. In practice, it can enhance resilience, because no single satellite or ground station is a single point of failure. There is also a political dimension. When an alliance declares that an attack on its space assets could trigger collective defense consultations, it sends a message that space is not a free hunting ground. However, it also commits members to respond in some way if a partner's satellite is targeted. Imagine a scenario where a small allied nation loses a key military communications satellite to a suspicious co-orbital incident. Do the larger powers treat that as an attack on the alliance? Do they retaliate in space, in cyberspace, or with economic sanctions? Or do they quietly replace the capability and issue a protest? The answers will set precedents. Space forces will be in the room when those answers are hammered out. Outside traditional alliances, new actors are emerging that do not fit neatly into the old categories. Some wealthy tech companies now control more satellites than many governments. Their decisions about where to provide coverage, how to prioritize users during congestion, and how to respond to hostile jamming have real strategic implications. In effect, these firms sometimes operate as micro-space forces of their own, even if they do not call themselves that. States are only beginning to grapple with what it means when a private company can, by flipping a software switch, influence the communication capacity of a country at war. Do you treat interference with such a company's satellites as an attack on the firm, on its home state, or on every client it serves? The law is still catching up. Looking forward a decade or two, the technical foundations of space warfare are likely to shift again. One major trend is autonomy. Today, satellite maneuvers are heavily scripted and supervised by humans. As constellations grow into the tens of thousands of satellites, human operators alone will not be able to manage every collision avoidance burn and every optimization. Onboard software will take over more routine decisions. The same logic will apply in conflict. Autonomous agents could be tasked to monitor local conditions, detect suspicious behavior, and recommend or even execute low-level responses without waiting for a human sitting in a bunker halfway around the world. This raises sobering questions. How do you verify that an autonomous system will not misinterpret a benign, close approach as an attack? How do you design fail-safes so that an algorithm does not escalate a confrontation in orbit faster than diplomats can pick up the phone on Earth? We already worry about automation in missile warning and air defense. Add the unique physics of space and the difficulty of real-time human oversight, and the stakes rise further. Space forces will need specialists who understand both orbital mechanics and machine learning, and they will need testing regimes robust enough to catch edge cases that could otherwise lead to unintentional conflict. Another emerging area is on-orbit servicing. Refueling, repairing, and upgrading satellites in space promises huge economic and military benefits. If you can extend the life of an expensive platform or plug in new sensors without launching a replacement, you save money and gain flexibility. The same technologies, however, can serve as tools for interference. A servicing vehicle with a gentle robotic arm can adjust a client satellite. It can also nudge an enemy satellite just wrong enough to degrade its mission. A tug that can deorbit debris can also deorbit someone else's active spacecraft. Here again, dual use is the rule, not the exception. Space forces will have to decide how much to invest in such capabilities, knowing that rivals will see them as potential weapons, no matter how they are branded. We should also talk about geography beyond the traditional Earth-centered orbits. As interest in the Moon and cislunar space grows, so will the temptation to extend military competition there. Resource extraction projects, relay satellites at Earth-Moon Lagrange points, and lunar bases all present juicy strategic opportunities. Control of cislunar trajectories might one day matter for missile warning or deep space surveillance. If that happens, space forces will face a new problem. The time and energy scales in cislunar space are much larger than in low Earth orbit. You cannot quickly reposition assets once they are committed. You need longer-term planning and more robust autonomy. In a sense, cislunar space could become the blue water ocean of the 21st century, with Earth orbit as the crowded coastal zone. Energy sources are part of the equation as well. Most current satellites rely on solar panels and batteries. For missions that require greater power or endurance in shadowed regions, nuclear power becomes tempting. That brings political baggage because of memories of nuclear weapons in space, even if the reactors are purely for electricity. A nuclear-powered military satellite operating in cislunar space would be an engineering achievement. It would also be a propaganda and diplomatic target. Even a routine failure that caused debris to re-enter the atmosphere would trigger outrage. Space forces and their political masters will have to weigh those trade-offs carefully. With all of these trends, the central challenge remains the same. How do you gain military advantage in space without poisoning the broader environment that everyone relies on? One approach is to emphasize reversible effects. Jamming that can be switched off. Dazzling that leaves sensors temporarily blinded but not fried. Cyber operations that disrupt functions without physically damaging hardware. These techniques are attractive because they seem less escalatory than blowing satellites into fragments. Yet even reversible attacks can have irreversible consequences if they occur at critical moments. A spoofed navigation signal at the wrong time can cause a deadly accident. A jammed missile warning satellite can feed catastrophic miscalculation. That is why some strategists argue that the most important task for space forces is not winning a space war, but preventing one from starting in the first place. This sounds abstract, but it translates into concrete measures. Clearer lines about what constitutes unacceptable behavior in orbit. Dedicated hotlines between major space powers to clarify incidents. Shared tracking data that can identify whose rocket body created a new debris swarm before conspiracy theories spread. Confidence-building steps like mutual observation of certain kinds of tests. None of this is glamorous. It is, however, the scaffolding that keeps a tense competition from turning into a chaotic brawl. You might ask yourself, Is all this effort to regulate conflict in space realistic? Or are we simply repeating the hopeful talk that preceded arms races in other domains? History gives a mixed answer. We failed to prevent arms races at sea before the First World War, despite treaties. We muddled through with partial success in limiting strategic nuclear weapons during the Cold War. The difference in space is that the consequences of unconstrained conflict would not only be military, they would hit global commerce, scientific research, and basic civil infrastructure in a way that citizens across many countries would feel immediately. That broad stake might create a stronger political constituency for restraint if publics understand what is at risk. For you as an observer, the rise of space forces might seem remote, yet it touches daily life. Every debate about 5G backhaul, every news story about satellite broadband in remote regions, every update about a mega constellation launch is indirectly about the infrastructure that space forces will try to protect and, in wartime, manage under attack. When a government announces a new space command or signs a data-sharing agreement about orbital debris, it is not just bureaucracy expanding. It is a recognition that modern power depends on invisible highways in the sky. Ignoring those highways because they are out of sight is a luxury that serious states are rapidly giving up. In the end, war above Earth is not an entirely new kind of war. It is an extension of an old dynamic. Whoever can see farther, coordinate faster, and strike more precisely tends to win. Space simply amplifies that dynamic to a global scale. The Space Force and its counterparts are the institutions we are building to operate the amplifiers. They can use them to stabilize crises by giving leaders better information and more precise options. Or they can use them to wage blinding contests that push conflicts into more desperate and dangerous phases. The technology will not decide which path we take. People will. So when you hear phrases like war fighting in space or space superiority, try to mentally translate them. They really mean this. Will your country still be able to see, talk, and navigate when things go wrong? Will your military still be able to coordinate under fire? Will your economy still function if parts of the orbital web flicker or fail? And can your rivals say the same? Those are the questions that keep space commanders awake at night. They know that above the clouds, the first moves of the next great power crisis may unfold in total silence, but their echoes will be heard everywhere on Earth.